Okay, this is my presentation. It's called A Bad Taste in Your Mouth, Fear of Identification and Mouthwashing. Fair warning, since mouthwashing is a psychological horror game, there will be some graphic descriptions and imagery, so proceed with caution. Okay, so the fastest game summary that I can provide. This is the first screen in the game. Before you begin the game, you get the setting, which is a space freighter, the time of the shipment, and the phrase, "I hope this hurts," which persists through the rest of the game and sets the scene. So first here we have the middle screen here, 0 days before the crash. The game begins here from the first person point of view. And for those unfamiliar, that means that you cannot see your character avatar while you are manipulating them in the game. You are prompted to turn left to avoid collision with an unidentified object. When you click the navigation, your only options are to turn right or to leave, and you even have to double down on crashing the ship by disabling autopilot. You don't know who you are or why you are crashing the ship at this point. Then you jump to 2 months after the crash, where you play as Jimmy, the co-captain and now captain of the freighter. You are still playing from the first person point of view, by the way. As Jimmy, you are trying to help the crew survive while they ask questions like why Curly, the old captain, crashed the ship. After all, he's the quadriplegic beef jerky guy on the left, who was in the cockpit when you crashed, so who else could it have been? Jumping back and forth from days before to months after the crash, the player realizes that Jimmy and Curly were friends back on Earth. Curly got Jimmy this job. The environment of the ship was pretty inhumane and inhospitable, and the crew are actually all to be laid off when they finish the shipment. Anya, the only woman on the ship, is pregnant and asks questions like why there aren't locks on the sleeping quarters. The whole time, the crew's lives are being put on the line for a massive shipment of miles and miles of mouthwash. The reality is, Jimmy crashed the ship. He forced himself on Anya, and to avoid backlash to both his and Curly's reputation, he crashes the ship. Curly stands by before trying to fix things at the last minute and gets the full force of the collision, thus creating him as Beef Jerky Guy. Um, Jimmy, who probably had a tenuous relationship with reality beforehand, leads the crew to death either through negligence or outright murder in surrealist sequences. All the while, he believes that he is fixing things by doing things like cutting off and feeding Curly his own leg, and placing him in the only remaining cryopod to live at least 20 more years in hopes of being rescued. Now, that was a lot of information, but what I want you to remember is that you, as the player, play as both Jimmy and Curly before and after the crash. And the game continually says things such as, take responsibility, which I believe is a way that the game is asking the player to acknowledge their role in the horror of the narrative of mouthwashing. So, jumping into some other scholars who have talked about this sort of thing. First is Ulf Wilhelmsen in 2006. He talked about game ego. He says that game ego is a bodily based function that provides and allows a game player a function of agency within a game environment, and hence is one source for subjectivity and identification within the game. Being a bodily based function, this presents a bridge between the game and the player's ego as one of affect and identification. Here on the right is an example of a Let's Play gamer seeing Jimmy during their playthrough. And a reminder, you're playing from first person point of view this entire time. So when you have a third person sequence, this Let's Play gamer says, "It's me," when seeing Curly. So clearly, this identification is working to a degree. Furthermore, further than perception, Williamson borrows from George Lakoff and Mark Johnson's 1980 article, where they talk about our bodies as a container through which we experience the outside world through the barriers of our skin. This schema of interior, boundary, and exterior creates a paradox of affect, since an observer can project onto the boundary of the screen and view themselves as a container within that screen. The boundary between the skin and the screen becomes blurred here. And furthermore, Williamson talks about even more than just a point of view. He talks about a point of being. This is when our perception, or what we see in the game coincides with our motor capabilities and corresponding sound cues. It gives you a feeling like being in the game. This tactile motor kinesthetic link, for example, you press a button and a character moves, allows a player and the ability to identify with their actions in the game and possibly take responsibility, as mouthwashing urges the player to do. An example of this is when you may be ducking from projectiles while you're really invested in a game, or even just moving your body to make a tighter turn. This is showing active tactile motor kinesthetic link. However, when there's a lag from input to feedback in the game, a player might view a character avatar as a hindrance for their ability to act within the game. Um, Mouthwashing, I believe, plays with this sort of identification through disidentification. An example of a lag in mouthwashing is when you play as Jimmy and you are trying to aim to shoot one of your crewmates in the head because he's chasing you. But as you get closer and closer to the character avatar, the controls slow with the action, and you might say something like, Jimmy, aim faster. The game, I believe, plays with this concept of disidentification. While you might feel disconnected from Jimmy because of the difficult controls, you are also ignoring Swansea's humanity for the sake of ending your discomfort. In that way, you're almost just as bad as Jimmy and on some level realigned with him. So, in some ways, disidentification can be seen as a passive interactivity with the game. So, how does passivity play into identification? Christopher and Lezuler in 2023 wrote an article about the active passive debate with horror films and horror games. In it, they challenge the notion that observation is a purely passive activity. The loss of agency you feel in viewing a horror film creates the affective tension in the audience and allows for the audience to feel. Allows the audience to identify or project onto characters in the film who are similarly stuck in this tension. So, one of the questions I had is, could playing a deterministic horror game from the perspective of a character who also lacks agency elicit a stronger sense of identification from the player? And for my class, I actually did a little study on this, and this will just be a little snippet. So, in the study, I observed four players through the first 30 to 50 minutes of the game. They all ended at a predetermined stopping point, but they took different amounts of time to get there. They went through three scenes in the game. First was the unpresented character avatar crashing the ship in the beginning. The second is playing from Jimmy's perspective 2 months after the crash, and then Curly's perspective 7 days before the crash. I'm only sharing my participants' responses to their Likert scale responses to the following statements. So I had them answer strongly agree to strongly disagreed for these four statements. The first is, I feel responsible for crashing the ship. The second, I feel responsible for Curly's well-being. The third, I can see parts of myself in Curly. And the fourth, I can see parts of myself in Jimmy. I used the thematic coding for these responses, and I added active and latent onto this idea of identification and disidentification with your actions in the game. And a quick clarification, I chose latent instead of passive here because I believe it showed potential for identification later, given more information, since again, it was only the first 30 to 50 minutes of the game. So, and then here are, clarifications of the coding. So first we have active disidentification. I coded responses with active disidentification when in a statement where the participant places blame elsewhere, be that the game or the characters. For example, I didn't do that, it was his fault. Next is latent disidentification. These were phrases of confusion or statements of inconclusive information. For example, I don't know enough about him or his motivations to feel connected to him. That's latent disidentification. Next is latent identification, and these are responses of reluctant responsibility due to a lack of choice or identification with their actions through the playable characters. So an interesting response here was, Curly hurt himself, but I made Jimmy give him meds. So there's a level of identification here, but it's sort of reluctant and through the character. And finally, I chose active identification, and these are statements willingly admitting responsibility or actively identifying with the playable characters. For example, in response to I can see parts of myself in Jimmy, a participant said, he is the one who I originally started controlling and understanding the game with, so I feel more connected with Jimmy. And these were my results. As expected, there was a strong latent disidentification because my players lacked a lot of necessary information at this point of the game to fully understand it. But surprisingly, the other large chunk was active identification. And some examples of responses are, I feel responsible because I was the one controlling Curly when he got attacked, and I hate to see people, even fake people, in pain. Another example is, as Jimmy, I do feel responsible for his, that being Curly's, well being. It seems like he is the only one taking responsibility for the actual caretaking and the only one who can handle his actual medical aspect of his health. So my players were actively identifying with their actions in these situations. But since my players really didn't see much of the horror elements of the game and their senses of identification weren't really challenged to the extent that they are in the rest of the game, I was interested in one instance where one of my participants changed their answer after some reluctant reflection. So, when completing the questionnaire, participant D originally chose strongly disagree for the statement, I can see parts of myself in Curly, and then unprompted changed to agree, made the big change to agree. When I asked why, they responded. So, at first, I'm like, oh no, I hate Jimmy. But then I'm like, oh wait, Jimmy has a lot of similarities with his personality. The bad parts of Jimmy are also kind of the bad parts of me. So I was like, well, I don't want to be like Jimmy, so I put disagree. But then I realized, wait, I kind of am like Jimmy at the same time. Um, so participant D notes a difference between wanting to see themselves in the character and admitting to seeing their negative traits reflected in an unlikable character. So, in answering how players can feel identification, even through instances that seem to violate their sense of self and free will, we can look to Bartel and his article in 2015 on free will and responsibility in video games. He talks about how video games represent deterministic worlds in which the player seems to lack free will, and that may challenge a player's internal moral code. Oh, sorry. Okay, sorry, I'm going through here. Internal moral code. So, borrowing from Harry Frankfurt's 1971 moral philosophy of free will in a deterministic universe, Bartel distinguishes between a player's freedom to act and a freedom to will to players' identification in their game. So, when talking about a freedom to will with the characters of the game, Jimmy and Curly. With all of the info in the game, statements like all my homies hate Jimmy or I'm not a rapist are viable responses to questions of identification with Jimmy. However, through acknowledging the environment and the absurd conditions of the Tulpar, some players might be able to acknowledge what they themselves are capable of in their basic when their basic human needs are violated. So, for example, here's a poster on the ship, and in the small text it says, do not indulge in over 5 hours of rest including leisure time. Sleeping over the allowed budget will result in disciplinary actions. Um, Furthermore, Ronnie Barrier in his IGN review says that people like this really exist, and in my worst moments, I can almost understand where they're coming from, even as they are painted in extremes here. So, if the player is still not willing to identify with Jimmy by the end of the game, they are Curly, helpless and stripped of autonomy, only realizing when it's too late, having things forced down your throat, and a passive participant yet not free from responsibility. So choose your player. Do you want to be active in ways that violate your morals, if you can even admit to that, or passive in a way that you could have stopped this, but you didn't, and you have to live with that?
Nice.
And that
You
is
done?
my presentation. Yeah,
Perfect. Yay!
thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. That was great. So our next presenter, like I said, is going to be asynchronous. So I have a video of them giving the presentation that we will watch together here. So give me a minute here to get that sorted out. All right, this will probably just be the best way to do it. So, all right. Can people in teams give me a thumbs up if you can see the video? Give me some affirmation. Fantastic. All righty. All of you can see the video, correct? Perfect. All righty. Let's go ahead and listen.
Corbin, the presentation is silent. We can't hear it.
Hold up. What was that said?
We can't hear the presentation. You may have to
Okay.
share your full screen.
No, thank you for saying that. Let me see if I can fix it. We have some extra time, so give me a moment. Let's see here. This might be a thing that I actually can't do. I'm not sure. Aha. Okay, cool. I fixed it. Okay, so let me know if you can hear now.
Embodiment of teenage desire turned deadly. Amy Dunn in Gone Girl 2014, whose intelligence and sexual freedom positions her as
Perfect.
both irresistible.
Okay, cool. Thank you for actually telling me that. Okay, let's go ahead and restart.
Hello everyone, my name is Suparna Ghosh. I am a student of Masters in English at the University of Calcutta. Today, I will be presenting my paper, Beauty That Kills, Tomie, the Male Thirst and the Horrors of Desire. The femme fatale has long haunted the screen and the page as a seductive yet dangerous woman, an enigmatic figure who weaponizes her beauty and allure to manipulate, control, and ultimately lead men to their downfall. This archetype, deep-rooted in early film noir and literary traditions as exemplified in characters such as Jennifer Check in Jennifer's Body 2009, whose seductive charm and supernatural hunger makes her the embodiment of teenage desire turned deadly. Amy Dunn in Gone Girl 2014, whose intelligence and sexual freedom positions her as both irresistible and lethal. These women, framed through the male gaze, are often punished for their transgressive sexuality, reinforcing patriarchal notions of danger tied to female desire and agency. Junji Ito's manga titled Tomie, however, reimagines the femme fatale through the grotesque and uncanny lens of Japanese horror. Tomie is not a calculating woman who consciously manipulates men. She is an immortal, a supernatural being whose very presence incites obsession, jealousy, and ultimately murder. Unlike the classic femme fatale, whose arc is often confined to a single downfall or betrayal, Tomie exists in a perpetual cycle of death and rebirth, eluding narrative closure and moral consequence. Her beauty is not a tool she wields, but rather a cursed condition, something so potent that it disrupts the mind of men and reveals the fragile and destructive course of male desire. Tomie's horror lies in her involuntary power. She does not scheme her way into men's heart or plot elaborate seductions. Instead, her presence alone acts as a psychological contagion. The men around her become increasingly paranoid, violent, and possessive, often culminating in frenzied attempts to murder her, only to be haunted by her inevitable return. Her symbol of uncontainable femininity continually returning to disrupt the patriarchal fantasy of dominance and control. Each fragmented piece of her body can regrow into another version of herself, multiplying the threat and defying the narrative logic. Drawing from Laura Mulvey's Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema 1975, Tomie exemplifies the to-be-looked-at-ness that defines the female figure in patriarchal cinematic structures. According to Mulvey, women in visual media are often positioned as passive spectacles for the heterosexual male gaze, objects of desire that only exist to forward the male protagonist's narrative. Tomie initially appears to fulfill this role. Her beauty is meticulously drawn, often exaggerated with flowing hair, delicate features, and schoolgirl innocence, conjuring the idealized fantasy of a submissive, hyper-feminine object. However, Tomie quickly subverts this role by refusing to remain an object. She disrupts narrative control by derailing the male character's agency, turning their desire into madness, and breaking the linear trajectory of cause and effect. As men attempt to control or destroy her, Tomie resists resolution through her regenerative power, rupturing the structure of visual pleasure itself. Number 1. Beauty as an irresistible and unnatural force. In the opening story of Tomie, Volume 1, Junji Ito introduces the titular character not through her living presence, but through the shock of her posthumous absence. As her classmates mourn during a school assembly, it is gradually revealed that Tomie had in fact been brutally murdered and dismembered by her teacher and several male classmates, individuals who had fallen inexplicably under her influence. The murder is not depicted as a premeditated act of violence rooted in jealousy or revenge. Rather, it emerges as a shared psychotic break, a collective descent into chaos catalyzed by something unnatural, that is Tomie's beauty. The scene on the school trip in particular illustrates this breakdown. Tomie subtly manipulates those around her, flirting with the teacher, creating emotional tension among the students. Yet her power is not portrayed as calculated. It's more like a contagious madness. Her very presence distorts the rational boundaries of thought and behavior. The group turns on her in a violent frenzy, not because of what she does, but because of what she is. An embodiment of desire that overwhelms their ability to possess or process it. This moment perfectly aligns with Laura Mulvey's concept of the male gaze. Tomie's hyperfeminine appearance positions her as the object of visual pleasure to be looked at-ness. Yet she does not remain a figure in a male-driven narrative. Instead, she triggers the collapse of narrative control. The men around her, meant to be the agents of action, are reduced to reactionary figures, processed, irrational, homicidal. Her beauty is not a pleasurable spectacle, but a destabilizing force, suggesting that the male gaze, when confronted with a woman who cannot be consumed or controlled, implodes upon itself. Moreover, the horror here lies in the ordinariness of the setting. A class trip, a teacher-student dynamic, teenage romance. Ito weaponizes these familiar tropes and injects into them an uncontainable force of desire, rendering Tomie's beauty not only fatal but otherworldly. Her death does not neutralize her. It multiplies her, defining the traditional horror arc where the monstrous woman is punished and removed. Instead, Tomie returns again and again, unbothered, unscarred, and just as irresistibly fatal as before. In this way, her beauty functions not as a reward for male fantasy, but as a virus within it, unsettling, irrational, and inescapable. Number 2. Obsession manifesting as possessiveness. In the manga Tomie photograph, the horror shifts from collective hysteria to a more intimate portrayal of obsession, centering on a male classmate who becomes consumed by the need to photograph Tomie. He is convinced that her unnaturally flawless appearance conceals something inhuman, and he believes that the camera might capture what the naked eye cannot see. His desire is no longer just to admire Tomie, it's to possess her, to expose her truth through the act of surveillance. This camera in this story is more than a narrative device. It becomes an extension of the male gaze, both in the Mulvian phase sense and in the horror genre's tradition of voyeurism. As Mulvey notes, the act of looking, especially in mainstream Hollywood cinema, it is coded with power. The camera allows the male audience to control the female subject, reducing her to an image of consumption. But in Tomie, this dynamic is reversed. The more the boy tries to capture Tomie's image, the less control he has over her. His photographs reveal uncanny distortions and unsettling duplications, suggesting that Tomie's beauty cannot be framed, fixed, or explained. Rather than granting him mastery, the camera only deepens his confusion and anxiety. The horror stems from his inability to dominate what he sees. Tomie's face refuses to stay still, refuses to be understood. Her appearance is not a window to truth, but a mirror of madness. As his fixation grows, he becomes isolated and paranoid, ultimately consumed by the very image he tries to pin down. This story literalizes the danger of the male gaze. It shows how the desire to see and own a woman's image can morph into pathological need for control. Tomie's beauty is like a glitch in the visual system. It breaks the mechanism of power behind the gaze. In this way, Tomie photograph critiques not only the gaze itself, but the illusion of control it offers. The camera, so often a weapon of authority, becomes a conduit for fear, proving that some beauty isn't meant to be possessed and some women cannot be contained. Number 3. Violence as a form of control over beauty. One of the most disturbing patterns in Tomie is the compulsion of men not only to possess her but to annihilate her. Across multiple stories, men, often lovers or authority figures, are driven to murder Tomie in the moments of overwhelming passion, obsession, or confusion. What's striking is that these acts of violence are rarely motivated by hatred alone. Rather, they are attempts to resolve the unbearable tension between desire and powerlessness. In Tomie Morita Hospital, this dynamic is literalized when a doctor, initially captivated by her beauty, becomes obsessed to the point of dissecting her. His medical authority, which should bring understanding and clarity, fails utterly in the face of Tomie's regenerative body. As he cuts her apart, she reassembles, her body rejecting his authority over life and death, biology, and classification. The operating room becomes a battleground of desire and dominance, whereas science cannot demystify or contain her power. Once again, as it draws upon Laura Mulvey's visual pleasure, in Tomie's case, the male gaze cannot stabilize her. Men attempt to destroy her, but not to erase her beauty, but because her beauty resists their control, because it reveals the illusion that the gaze offers mastery. In murdering Tomie, they seek to reassert power to stop the maddening loop of desire and impotence, but they fail each and every time. Tomie's regeneration subverts horror conventions and gendered expectations. Unlike typical female monsters who are vanquished by the end, she returns. And not only does she return, she multiplies. Each violent act against her literally creates more Tomies, more terror, more autonomy. This biological defiance becomes a metaphor for the fear of female agency, of a femininity that cannot be destroyed, erased, or solved. Number 4. beauty that defies death and sparks repetition. Tomie's horror lies not only in her immortality, but in her ability to regenerate and multiply, triggering an endless loop of obsession, violence, and rebirth. Her beauty is not bound to a single body. It's viral, spreading across people, places, and forms. This regenerative quality turns her into an idea rather than a person, a persistent fantasy that refuses to die. In Tomie hair, for instance, a strand of her hair infects another girl, causing Tomie's face and personality to slowly take over the host. The girl becomes an unwilling vessel for Tomie's return, and the men around her fall under the same obsessive spell, unaware that they are being drawn to an imitation, not the original. In this episode, Tomie's beauty functions less as a personal trait but more like a haunting force. Her attractiveness symbolizes the persistence of the male gaze, even when it is misplaced or artificial. Men are not just obsessed with Tomie, they are obsessed with the idea of Tomie, which suggests that the desire itself is what fuels the horror and not the women. Laura Mulvey argues that classical cinema offers male viewers a voyeuristic pleasure where the female body is controlled through visual mastery. Tomie, however, breaks this mechanism. Her presence can't be contained by the male gaze because it repeats itself. Even when seemingly erased, cut up, destroyed, or forgotten, Tomie's beauty finds new life and new victims. In this way, Ito criticizes the fantasy of dominance embedded in visual pleasure. Men believe that they can possess Tomie, but she always remains out of their reach, always returning, always asserting her autonomy through repetition. Conclusion. Tomie's beauty is not merely an aesthetic trait, it is a horror device, a weaponized embodiment of desire that exposes the instability and violence embedded within the male gaze. As Junji Ito presents her, Tomie is less a character and more of a phenomenon, an immortal force that draws out the darkest instincts of those who look upon her. Her beauty becomes a site of both attraction and annihilation. Her repeated deaths and regenerations are not just supernatural features, they symbolize how patriarchal structures attempt to control female sexuality through objectification only to be undone by their own compulsions. Drawing from Laura Mulvey's visual pleasure and narrative cinema, we can see that Tomie is initially framed as a classical object of scopophilic pleasure, beautiful, mysterious, framed for consumption. However, she resists the narrative conventions that would traditionally lead her punishment or narrative closure. Instead, she regenerates, multiplies, and returns, disrupting any attempt at visual mastery or narrative resolution. Her refusal to stay dead is a refusal to be reduced to a controllable image. In this way, Tomie subverts the cinematic logic of the male gaze. She is seen, desired, and then feared, not because she acts, but because her very existence destabilizes the illusion of control that the male gaze depends on. Ultimately, Tomie does not empower herself in the traditional feminist sense. Instead, she becomes a mirror reflecting the horror of male fantasy back onto itself. Her beauty does not save her or elevate her, it destroys others. By examining Tomie through this lens, we are forced to reconsider not just the figure of femme fatale, but the systems of desire, control, and the visual pleasure that makes this possible. Thank you.
Yay! Directed by input title. Perfect. Okay, so thank you for that. And now we'll just spend a few minutes, maybe like 5-ish, because we only have one presenter with us to be asking questions. And so feel free to ask or type in the chat, but I'm going to be selfish because I have a question I want to ask first. I should ask, do you go by Elizabeth, or should I call you something different?
Elizabeth's fine.
Okay, perfect. So, I first off love your topic. I think it's super interesting and engaging. The fact that you did some quantitative data as well, I thought was really cool. But one thing you didn't go into detail on in the presentation that you might have thought about is what elements of game design make that the connection between a person playing the game and the character, because like I've played games that are first person but they don't evoke that same relationship and identification. So I just wanted you to talk maybe more about what elements of games foster that identification.
Yeah, I think so one of the things that I didn't really talk about here that I kind of not necessarily disproved, but I couldn't find enough evidence to back it up in my study was that um, characters with and without signifiers being more of uh, like a blank slate on which to identify versus like a character that already has all of these signifiers, if that affects a player's willingness to identify with the actions they take while moving that character avatar. I found that even though I only had 4 participants, obviously it's not like a really wide study, but the participants who did not identify with their actions did not identify with their actions before there was a character avatar and after the character avatar. It was consistent throughout. Um, but I seen because I had a pretty wide results. I have one person who just like did not want to identify with anything. They said, I didn't do this. It wasn't my fault. It was all that character. Don't blame me for anything. Versus another player who felt like really guilty for everything that they did in the game. So I think a lot of it has to do with what you're bringing into your experience of the game and what you're willing to really connect with. One of my players said that the graphics was really disorienting for them and that they couldn't really identify because it had this PS2 style graphics in the game. And then for others, it doesn't matter what it looks like as long as there's like a narrative through line they can connect. So a lot of it is just the attitude that you're bringing into the game. But in terms of design, like I mentioned with Williamson, this like affective link comes from you have to be able to move something, and then if you move something and it affects your ability to interact with the game, then there's like a stronger identification. But there's like a whole host of other things that can affect that too.
Thank you. You guys got a question? I'll ask another one. I'll ask another one. Oh, let me get this person first, though. So we have a commenter. They asked, do you think a player is more likely to identify with a character in game when it's in a horror genre, or could it happen in other genres? That was my same exact question. Do you think it's more connected to the narrative overall or to the character?
I do think that there's a level of one of my participants said that they went through more with the character, so they were more willing to identify with them. So I think the extremes of narrative in horror can like be a quick, you know, path to identification. But I don't think it just happens in horror games. But it's interesting to see how like passivity within the narrative can create identification. Like this whole like active passive debate, I think is interesting, especially in that genre.
Awesome. Thank you for that. We got about time for one or two more quick questions. So it looks like another question. Do you think identification is more likely when a person creates and names their character, or could it be about the same with a pre-made character?
Yeah, that's kind of what I was exploring a little bit with the characters with and without signifiers. One of my friends in the class that I'm taking that I did this with did something different where players were able to put in a name for the character, and that um, maybe that helps with identification. There wasn't strong conclusive evidence for that. I think it's more so seeing yourself reflected in a character, and if you can find ways to reflect within that character. So it could be that you have a character avatar and you move through the world, but you don't feel connected to your actions in the same way that like anonymity online can help you feel free from that responsibility as well. So in my research, it doesn't seem to be like a one or the other situation. So it's hard to say exactly like how strong that identification is. There's like a more factors to it, I think.
Okay, and then our final question here. In a horror setting, what do you think that active engagement changes about how you feel leaving the game? Do you think that other series like Silent Hill or Squirrel Stapler could benefit from another
Mhm.
type of engagement like active versus passive rather than the linear?
Yeah, I think that's interesting because especially in mouthwashing, and this is also pulling from just watching people play on playthroughs online. Um, I've seen a lot of people while they're in the sequence where they have to hunt down Swansea and they have to shoot him in the head 2 times. It's part of a surrealist sequence where it's Jimmy not really connecting with reality. And then when you do come to the reality sequence, it's completely um, observational. You're watching Jimmy and Swansea talk to each other before he actually shoots him. However, in that scene, I've seen quite a few players be like, oh, we're the bad guy, like that moment. So I think that this sort of idea about being active within the game is not necessarily as important as you think it might be. And I think there's more of an idea of how how you feel interacting with the narrative, and that can happen from observing, that can happen from inputting player input, or just reading a novel. I think that there's a level of identification and activity within all kinds of narrative structures.
Awesome. You've been great, Elizabeth. Thank you so much. Let's give another round of applause.